The public treason trial of Donald John Trump, 5 March 2024. Plaintiffs, citizens of the United States of America. Defendant, former President Donald John Trump. Since the defendant, Donald John Trump, likes to air his legal matters in public, the citizens of the United States will have the opportunity to publicly hear charges and examine evidences to which they were already witnesses. The defendant cannot claim these charges and evidences are witch hunts or some deep state plan. The defendant committed no less than 3 acts of treason while serving as the 45th President of the United States of America. In fact, the defendant, in an autistic rant, even suggested that impeachment charges against him were witch hunts, but it would be different if it was treason. Christians, active duty and former military members, and all other patriotic Americans will be able to render judgment in this trial. The defendant, Donald John Trump, is an elderly male who exhibits clear signs of autism. That diagnosis was possibly made very early in the defendant's life and should be documented in the primary or secondary school records, which the defendant has fought and threatened to keep out of public examination. Let us look at Exhibit A, which is Merriam-Webster Dictionary's definition of autism. Autism, a variable developmental disorder that appears by age 3 and is characterized especially by difficulties in forming and maintaining social relationships, by impairment of the ability to communicate verbally or non-verbally, and by repetitive behavior patterns and restricted interests and activities. The chief diagnostic signs of autism are social isolation, lack of eye contact, poor language capacity, and absence of empathy. An examination of the autism website will also give more symptoms, which many of you can attest you have witnessed. The autism of the defendant is relevant because it shows a mental state that is dangerous to the presidency. Defendant Donald John Trump's mockery of those with disabilities is compensation for his own mental disability. What many around him and follow him took for funny and odd behavior was really manifestation of his lifelong autism. Acting like an unhinged child is not appropriate for any adult, especially one that sits in the presidency. Treason charges. Count 1. Defendant Donald John Trump, on or about May 2017, aided and abetted an enemy of the United States when he voluntarily shared classified sensitive sources and means to 2 representatives of the Russian government while they visited the White House. Count 2. Defendant Donald John Trump, on or about May 2018, took no action against Russia when U.S. troops in Syria came under violent attack by Russian government mercenaries. Count 3. Defendant Donald John Trump, on or about January 2020, failed in his duty as Commander-in-Chief of the United States military when he worked in consultation and negotiation with Russia to allow another enemy, an adversary, Iran, to bomb U.S. troops in Iraq with no retaliation. As to count 1, the defendant Donald John Trump has shown great admiration for our Russian adversaries, who make it no secret that they desire to undermine the United States and shed American blood whenever possible. Russian operatives must have recognized the defendant's autism long ago and sought to exploit. In a show of the inappropriate childlike conduct, the defendant voluntarily shared classified information to these Russian operatives on their first meeting. The defendant even banned members of the American press, but Russia brought their own press for manipulative photos. See Exhibit B. Trump manipulated by Russians. Americans have heard the defendant rant and rave about our NATO allies not paying their fair share. The defendant did so during and after his presidency. The contrast in treatment of communist authoritative dictatorships and our democratic allies is quite different. Contrast the image in Exhibit B with the one concerning our NATO allies in Exhibit C. Trump acting like a child. The treatment of Russian operatives and coordination with the same continued throughout the presidency of the defendant. In an effort to prop up defendant Donald John Trump, in April 2017, the Russians coordinated with their Syrian allies to allow the defendant to order a retaliatory strike on basically vacated areas in response to the Syrian government use of chemical weapons. Be mindful that autistic individuals lack empathy. Therefore, the defendant had no concern about Syrians using chemical weapons. As to count two, the defendant, Donald John Trump, failed in his role as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military by not taking actions against the Russian government for the actions of their mercenaries, acting on Russian government directions. Based on battle accounts by U.S. service members, on 18 May 2018, a group of about 500 well-trained and heavily armed Russian mercenaries and Syrian fighters attacked a small group of American Special Forces and Syrian Democratic Forces. The intent was clearly to destroy the Americans and their allies. By the grace of God, the Special Forces were able to call in air support. The American Superior Air Support was able to destroy the attackers and kill reportedly 200 to 300. After the battle was over, the defendant, having full knowledge, did nothing. He did not issue any statements or retaliate against the Russian government because in his autistic mind, the Americans won. Be mindful that shedding the blood of Americans is a goal of our adversaries. It appears he would have been fine if some American troops were killed. That last statement suggesting the defendant would not have been alarmed may shock some. However, the evidences will show he was not empathetic to what those Special Forces members faced and had to endure for hours until air support arrived. Consider that about 2 months later, in July 2018, the defendant Donald John Trump met with the Russian President Putin in Helsinki. The defendant demanded a closed-door one-on-one meeting with only interpreters in the room. The defendant came out of the meeting looking disheveled and tired, while Putin looked energized. Examine Exhibit D. American citizens, and particularly American military members, should be disgusted that the Commander-in-Chief could smile with an adversary that 2 months earlier attempted to shed American blood. As a further insult, in his autistic manner, the defendant Donald John Trump said he believed the Russian dictator's word over the U.S. intelligence community. Sadly, to this day, the current administration has not opened the records of that secret meeting to let the American citizens know what was said. As to count 3, the plot becomes more complicated. However, with a timeline, we are able to see exactly what happened. Exhibits E, F, and G will paint a timeline to show the treasonous actions of the defendant, Donald John Trump. In Exhibit E, in December 2019, when the defendant faced impeachment, his Russian operatives came to show they stand behind him. In Exhibit F, let us flash back a bit. The Russians and Iranians worked together in Syria. In 2015, popular Iranian General Soleimani visited Russia to talk operational plans. Thus, the Russians knew his operational plans and locations. It is believed that to prop up the defendant and to distract from the impeachment, the Russians offered up Soleimani's location to defendant Donald John Trump. Soleimani was wanted and suspected in the injury or deaths of hundreds of Americans. The Russian government was well aware of this. On or about 3 January 2020, somehow the defendant was given coordinates and ordered the assassination. Immediately the Russians stepped in and offered to play peacemaker. They offered the defendant Donald John Trump a way to not escalate the conflict. Their suggestion or directive to the defendant was to allow the Iranians to retaliate against U.S. forces in Iraq, but the U.S. would do nothing further. In the most horrible, treasonous act, the defendant Donald John Trump agreed. The Russians appeared to have manipulated both sides in their quest to protect the defendant, to undermine American power, and shed American blood. On about 7 January 2020, the Iranian military launched more than a dozen 1,000-pound ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi air bases where U.S. troops were housed. Nearly 100 American military members sustained traumatic brain injuries. In an unempathetic response, the defendant, Donald John Trump, said they just had bad headaches. This came from an autistic draft dodger that claims to be smarter than our generals and admirals. Except for the grace of God, many of our fellow American military members could have been killed. In truth, the brain injuries could be debilitating and still causing health issues. In his autistic mannerism, he was cold and uncaring. Exhibit G shows the damage to the housing areas of our troops. These charges of treason and their evidences are real and dangerous. The extreme right and the extreme left are also dangerous to our nation. Bringing forth this information is not a Republican or Democratic exercise, nor is it pro-Biden or anti-Trump. It is about a traitor and his actions to undermine our democratic republic and the United States Constitution. In his own autistic words, the defendant Donald John Trump claims to have immunity to do as he pleases and that he is not bound by the United States Constitution. Christians know that there is no way this nation can tolerate an autistic, unhinged person in the presidency. Speaking and acting with blasphemous, perverted, hateful, cowardly attitudes is contrary to civilized American life. In a Christian nation like the United States, MAGA does not appear to me make America great again, but rather minimizing anti-God attitudes. Military veterans like Pompeo and Bannon knew the conduct mentioned in this trial rose to the level of treason and did nothing but support the defendant. Christianity requires that we love. This does not mean that we have to accept immoral conduct from the left or right. Whether you love the defendant or not, this trial is not meant to alter your sentiments. In fact, you can love the individual and appreciate any good you perceive he did. However, in the larger picture, his autism is a developmental risk we cannot take. The evidences prove that he is not capable of operating in democracy. By the grace of God, there were a few people in his administration that knew there were limits. The defendant has been clear that he does not want anyone like that in the future. Consider this. The Russians have made their desire for Alaska no secret. Do not be surprised if the defendant, Donald John Trump, if given an opportunity, would not rule out selling or giving the state to Russia. Since the defendant has claimed to be smarter than the generals and admirals, he should stand before a military tribunal to be judged for these acts of treason. If you understand these charges and the evidences, the best solution is for Republican voters and the Republican Party to give us another candidate that vows to be loyal to our flag, the United States Constitution, and our military. As for the Russians, they will probably be occupied in trying to explain to the Iranian government the betrayal of General Soleimani and their manipulative, deceptive actions. Many in our nation hope the defendant Donald John Trump gets the mental help he needs. Our nation is in need of rebuilding, not destruction. Every great empire collapses from within. Going the way of failed authoritative dictators or communism is not any solution. The defendant has found a way to appeal to the anger of citizens. Getting votes by anger is no solution. Pitting Americans against each other with no solutions in mind is a recipe for collapse of the nation. There are solutions for abortion, crime, the economy, housing, and immigration, which will be acceptable to the vast majority of citizens. There is an important Bible scripture that is relevant to the United States of America. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14. Christians have been on the sideline too long. It is time to stand up and govern like a Christian.